Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon to share some thoughts on a topic which Robin more or less accurately described. But actually the topic I'm going to speak to exactly is towards a principled basis for international relations and cultural diplomacy in the Commonwealth and the global community of nations, lessons to be drawn from the Brexit referendum. I'm sorry that I missed whatever was said earlier about the Brexit referendum because it would have been helpful to be able to sort of latch on to various threads during that time and to understand what everyone's thinking is. But regardless of that, whatever one thinks of the Brexit referendum result, whether one's a Remain or a Brexit supporter, the protracted and acrimonious debate that preceded it, and I might say that is still continuing, in fact more intensively than ever, about the rights and wrongs of staying in or leaving. It's given all of those of us who believe in the importance of building a world of lasting peace, going beyond boundaries of religion, ethnicity, race, culture, and not least nationality, really a lot to ponder about. The big question, as I see it, from the perspective of this particular conference anyway, is do we as a nation have the cultural values to enable us to play a truly constructive part in international affairs and in the whole Brexit debate? Sadly, I think, whatever one's stance on UK membership of the EU, one has to admit that the Brexit issue has highlighted certain serious weaknesses in our national mindset that are not favourable to this nation playing its fullest possible role in building the kind of world that I'm sure those of us who are here would like to see it assist. What we have seen, it's interesting that I was coming through through Victoria Station just now. I don't know how good your eyesight is, whether you can see that, but that's the headline on today's paper. We're several months after the referendum, and we see headlines like in today's Evening Standard, hate crime soars after Brexit vote. One illustration. But it's not just hate crimes. We can say that nationalism, xenophobia, racism, self-interested thinking of all kinds has flourished, almost like an epidemic, in the environment created by the whole Brexit issue. We don't have to think back very far to remember the very tragic murder of Jo Cox, the very remarkable MP who did such a lot throughout her whole life for other people. And other people meaning not just British people. She was an exemplary constituency MP up in Yorkshire, but also she spent a lot of her life campaigning for issues beyond these shores, for Africa and all kinds of other relatively disadvantaged places around the world. And she was killed, let's not prejudge the guilt or innocence of the person who's charged, but she was killed by somebody, this is independently verified by many people, who shouted, as he killed her, "Britain first." Now, that ought to, in my opinion, have focused a national debate about where our thinking should lie as a nation. What does Britain first mean? Does it mean only think about Britain, what we think is best for us, what will work for us, what is to our national advantage, our individual advantage as British people? Or should we be thinking in a far more holistic way about the world as a whole and Britain in the context of that world? I think that's the big question that whole incident raises for all of us. Of course, examples of this self-interested thinking I already mentioned, the xenophobia and the hate crimes, but also let's remember the whole debate. What was it, in what sort of terms was it cast? What sort of spirit was it conducted in? And I think probably most of us would agree that it was a very selfish one. Selfish, why? Because the politicians who carried on the debate mainly had very self-interested motivations to save my party and the unity of my party. Others maybe just to save my seat, always thinking about own interests and almost no reference. I have to say the shining example, I wanted to say this while she was still here, but the only time that I heard one serious politician mention about anything not in our narrow self-interest, not thinking just of Britain alone, was when Natalie Bennett's colleague Caroline Lucas mentioned about the fact that the EU had been able to keep the peace in Europe for 70 years. But that was about a 5-second remark in a debate that lasted many months. That is personally the only example I heard of any internationalist or beyond British thinking in the whole debate. So that is also one of the things that was really, in my mind, very wrong in the whole debate. The failure to see the EU in proper perspective. We heard a lot about its faults, and I wouldn't deny the faults. In fact, I could add my own long list of faults of the EU. I might add that if British people had been really fair, they would also have mentioned that we do just have one or two small faults of our own. But I didn't hear that. I heard democratic deficit in the EU. Well, what democratic deficit do we have in the UK? In the EU, it's perfectly true. We didn't agree as a European continent to elect a president directly by the electorate of Europe for the European Union. So there is a certain democratic deficit there. The person who's president of the EU Council, the person who's president of the Commission, both of those people, they're not completely without democratic oversight because they're appointed or suggested by those who are elected by each individual nation as their leaders, and it's subject to the scrutiny of the European Parliament. But what about the UK? I'm actually somebody who's a monarchist. I have no problem with an unelected head of state in this country, but we have never cast a single vote in our history for our head of state, and yet we accuse others of having a democratic deficit. Similarly, we have a House of Lords that is completely unelected, and also quite a few members of the House of Lords, I believe rightly, become members of a government. So that we can say government ministers, quite a few government ministers, were never elected. So there is this kind of imbalanced, lacking thinking, lacking objectivity about the EU itself, the ones we want to criticize, and a complete failure to look at our own problems and difficulties. So when we look at the EU fairly, of course, we can agree to many, if not most, of the criticisms that were leveled against it, maybe add a few more of our own. But we have to acknowledge two extraordinary things about the EU that were never discussed in any discussion I saw on television or heard on the radio, or even hardly in any articles in the newspapers. First of all, this point about what has held the peace for the last 70 years. 70 years ago, France and Germany were two countries that had, for literally, with interludes, peaceful interludes, been locked together in strife, in fighting each other, conquering a bit of each other's territory, conquering the other one, conquering a little bit back in, the area of Europe I'm talking about, Alsace-Lorraine. And they agreed to be part of what has now become the EU. And they are now as locked together in peaceful enterprise as two nations could be. They started out with a coal and steel community, and then they've gone on to all kinds of other levels of cooperation. This is in itself a remarkable achievement of the EU. And of course, one could say the same about many other nations. And more than that, though, there has been no experiment in the world, in the history of mankind, that has seen governments work as closely together in relative unity and relative harmony, agreed, as we have seen with the European Union. And many other, actually the UPF, which I was then the Secretary General of for Europe, was asked to help with a project in the Far East to extol the virtues to the ASEAN community, which is a embryonic kind of EU in that part of the world, of having close intergovernmental cooperation, locking together nations on some level in joint enterprise and also pooling of sovereignty. And so I became very aware that other parts of the world were looking at the EU as some kind of role model or example to follow. Of course, the good bits and not the bad bits. We have to concede that. But still, embryonic example for the rest of the world to follow. So the problem was that we, in the whole Brexit debate, we didn't debate anything of any significance anyway about what is our responsibility to other nations. This is the absolutely key thing. How does the world order hold together? It's because to a certain degree, not nearly enough, nation states are able to think about what they owe to other nations, what they should do for Syrian refugees or for Syria, what they should do for the Sudan when it's going through a great crisis, what they should do in all kinds of trouble spots all around the world. We have a certain capacity, we've demonstrated a certain capacity to do this in the history of the world. But in fact, it's not really nearly been enough. The irony is, I think, that the UK, more than most other nations in the world today, more, if you look at it from the historical perspective from the last several hundred years, the UK has actually done more to bring about harmony and unity and high-level cultural values in other nations than probably any other single nation. What we did, just to cite three examples, was we enabled Protestant Christianity to be spread throughout many nations of the world. Over 50 nations in the world have a strong foundation of Protestant Christianity. Well, I'm not saying you have to agree with Protestant Christianity on all points, but I think most people would agree that Protestant Christianity has done a great deal of good for those nations. And a lot of people in those nations, which is more to the point, also agree with that point. And they have formed a very important part in developing the culture and the whole infrastructure of those nations. Again, just two small examples. The legal system in countries like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, many African nations, and most Commonwealth nations, I have to say, is largely inherited from the British legal system, the common law tradition. And of course, that tradition in itself has been very much influenced by Christianity, originally by Catholicism and more latterly by Protestantism. So those nations who have that system are on the whole, very grateful for that system. They've never jettisoned it, they've never discarded it in any way. They have built upon it, they've evolved it, but fundamentally it is the British legal system and British legal principles that have been inherited. And then finally, as a brief example, we can talk about educational foundations. So many universities around the world have been founded based on the British model in Africa, in Australasia, wherever you go, well, many places in the world. Universities, colleges, schools, and so on are founded on the principles that we use to build British universities, and also the United States, I might mention, although of course it's not a member of the Commonwealth. So we have this great global heritage that goes back 500-600 years, and probably more of that kind of heritage, more of that kind of soft power influence with other nations than any other single nation. America, of course, has tremendous influence in the world now, but that only goes back maybe 2-3 generations. What Britain did culturally for the rest of the world goes back probably something like 18 generations, as opposed to America's 3. So the point that I'm leading up to is, what is the way in which the international community, the community of nations, should be structured? Well, in UPF we teach a philosophy of peace that I don't have time to go into too much today, but from it we can see that every level of life, from small cells to global societies, have to be structured in a certain way to be harmonious, to be functional, and to be productive. When you look at the body, there are cell systems within our body that rely on the smaller systems, and organs as well, which rely on smaller systems supporting larger systems. Therefore, we can say that cells and all the constituent parts of an individual human body practice the ideal that we talk about in the Universal Peace Federation of living for the sake of others. If cells stop living for the sake of others, then the individual person can get cancer and all kinds of other diseases and lose their physical life. So this living for the sake of others is true of all entities, from the smallest cells, the smallest particles of matter, up to the greatest organizations in the world, from the individual to the family to the society. And in terms of nations, we can say the same is true. If nations don't live for the sake of others, then the international community breaks down. Look at what's happening in Syria now, the prime example that we can cite. So we need to have a consciousness as individuals, and we need to have a consciousness as a nation of living for the sake of others. But what was absent in the Brexit referendum debate and in the result was a consciousness of what Britain should do for the world rather than what the world can do for Britain. We heard all about Britain's best interests. How can we get the most? How can we gain the most? That's all very well. A nation has to be concerned about its own sustainability, its own wealth creation, so that it has wealth, and it has both cultural wealth and material wealth that it can share with other nations. It has to do that. Otherwise, it can't fulfill its function. But the reason that we have those things, the reason we as individuals have things to material and also cultural, is so that we can share them with others as well as use them for ourselves. And so therefore, what I want to, just by way of conclusion to my short talk, to talk about is what can we as NGOs, Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, UPF, and all kinds of other NGOs that are doing, dare I say it, very good work in the world and basically functioning according to these ideals. I think what we can do and should do in this current context, at least in this country, is to educate the nation, the institutions, the leaders, the government, but also all the individual people as much as possible, about having a national consciousness. A national consciousness should not be proud of what we have so much as proud of what we are able to give. And this nation does give a lot to other nations. I mean, we talk about Syria. In fact, we are going to be giving, and on the way to giving, over £1 billion to help those refugees we heard about from Natalie Bennett in the neighboring countries around Syria to survive and hopefully to put back their lives together again. And that's very good. And we do give foreign aid, and we heard a lot from David Cameron about the high level of foreign aid that the government is giving. These are all commendable things. But actually, in terms of what we could give and should give, it's not so much that we can really be proud of, because we have a lot. If you look at a small nation, a poor nation, obviously what they can give is correspondingly much smaller than a nation like ours. So therefore, I think what I'd like to say in conclusion is that we NGOs need to educate this nation, and I believe also the same is true of every other nation, but I'm talking about Brexit and I'm talking about our current context, to have that kind of consciousness, so that if we have any more debates about Brexit, or if we get to debate, or our parliamentarians get to debate, if Theresa May is feeling very generous, about the terms of Brexit, or even if we get the chance for another referendum, once our economy has started to subside dramatically and people have realized that they were misled or mistaken or whatever it is in voting for Brexit, then the debate can be carried on a completely different level, that we can think about our responsibility to others first, and of course our own well-being and so on in that context. And that is what I think that UPF will be doing. I was having a discussion about that this morning in the future, and I'm sure many other NGOs are thinking that, but I hope that that really becomes the new benchmark for public debates of this kind in the future. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent. And Sir Mark Brann, thank you very much. Excellent for the
Thank you.
Excellent input on this conference. We would like to take some questions first. Yes.
Anyone?
Any questions?
Comment?
Margaret have a comment.
I always have, yeah.
She'll tell me afterwards, I think.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. My Japanese friend.
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Hello, thank you for your great presentation. I'm from Japan, now I'm working in Poland.
Right.
But from my experience, because I used to work for Oxfam branch in Japan. And that time I really realized that Oxfam is making a good image of Britain, because Japan also did very bad things during the war, and we don't have that kind of international NGOs which are helping other nations. And that's why I was always thinking Britain is doing, not only Oxfam, right? I mean, you have so many NGOs, international organizations. And what you said now, you said you have to educate the nations now. And what do you think you will face the most difficulty to educate the nations who are kind of separate?
I'm not sure that everybody in the nation wants to be educated. That's one problem. But we have, just speaking about UPF for the moment, but I think we need to think about it in a wider way than that. But we have something like 100 members of parliament who know us very well and are open to us in various ways. That's quite a substantial proportion of the whole, probably slightly under 10%. And we can hold, for example, in Parliament, this is just off the top of my head thinking, but we could hold a seminar in Parliament about our national responsibility on some level. Because honestly speaking, this consciousness is very lacking in this government and also in the Parliament as a whole. We hear Theresa May talking about the determination of the Brexit ministers to get the very best terms for Britain. Well, that's fine. But where is the consciousness of also not trying to damage the EU? We've done a lot of damage to the EU, which was already damaged, of course, in many ways. We need to inject this consciousness into our government, into parliamentarians, anyone who will listen. The problem is, will people listen? Because it's a feature of our age, sadly, that people tend to be very consumed with their own situations and own woes and miseries and so on, and that's understandable enough. But if we lose a sense of the whole, a vision of the whole, or of other people's situations, in fact, that other people's situations are often worse than our own, then we have lost the most important thing, in my opinion, because we are not in this world just to live for ourselves. We're here to, of course, live for ourselves, but for the sake also of living for the sake of others. And we have to get that message across very strongly.
Mark, you've got a job now.
I've got a job at last. Great. Good. Okay.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. You?
I'm relieved that there are at least some questions.
Sorry, I
That's
came
good.
in a bit late, but
okay.
I gathered something anyway from
Yeah.
what you had to say,
Yeah.
what you said. I just wanted to find out, is there a possibility of all the NGOs going in, for example, when they come to Africa, to go in with one voice, going rather than going in individually, as Oxfam does and other organizations that are here. When they go, for example, there have been some kind of help that is needed in any African country or any other part of the world. Oh, sorry. My name is Stephen Molindra, and I'm a journalist from Uganda. So that if Oxfam and other organizations that are based here can go in, or based in Europe, can go into, say like when a unified group. I don't know whether that, because they have been going into disaster zones separately, when the Himalayans had the earthquake. There wasn't that coordination, and in a way, even the Himalayans, the country itself was saying, look, you're bringing in all this aid, but we're finding it difficult. But if you're coming in as one group, it will be easier to coordinate the help. So it's the same thing in other parts of the world. I don't know whether this can be done, because
I'm really not expert enough, and I certainly can't speak for other organizations. I can imagine there could be more cooperation always, and certainly speaking for UPF, I can say we very much believe in that, and I think our cooperation with Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is part of that. We're very, very grateful for that cooperation and proud of that cooperation. But yes, NGOs can cooperate more. In fairness to them, from what I do know, just as a lay observer, I think there is a lot of cooperation actually, and quite a bit of coordination by UN agencies and others of NGOs on the ground in in the Middle East and in Africa and so on. But of course, I'm sure there can be more cooperation, and maybe not all NGOs need to exist separately from each other. Maybe some can merge, I don't know, and be more effective as a result. But I'm not really an expert on that, so I don't. Sorry? What?
Okay, so this is actually not the question. I just want to respond to my fellow friend.
Yeah.
I'm working in Sudan with the UNDP, and I really see like this challenge also in Afghanistan. I mean, many NGOs, they're doing the same kind of job in same kind of locations and duplication, waste of the resources. And we have witnessed like more than $1 billion they invested in Afghanistan to rebuild the justice system, and they failed.
Right.
So what we have done actually now in Sudan, we started like, not NGOs, at least we are bringing now all UN agencies together, and we designed a joint rule of law program for Darfur. We are focusing on all 5 states of Darfur, and this is really a model now. This has succeeded in Somalia, and also succeeded in Mali.
Right.
And this initiative was by the General Secretary with the Peacekeeping Force Department. They have political dimension, and also UNDP is a development. So they're working together as a secretariat in New York, and they're putting all these UN agencies now to work together to really stop duplication of work, and also and go with one voice. And also sometimes one NGO have staff, resources in one area, and when the other NGO comes to do the same kind of work, they put those money in same kind of infrastructure and to operate. So we started now as a UN, and I really hope that we see NGOs could come with the same kind of mechanism.
Very kind.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.